excited to be here. Thank you, Angular Connect, for having me. This has been such a great conference so far, right?
Yes.
Awesome. So, my name is Naomi Meyer, and I work as a software development engineer at Adobe in New York City, and I'm really excited to share with you all today some tips and tricks about building Angular apps with internationalization in mind. So can we get a quick show of hands? Who here is currently internationalizing their apps? Okay, awesome. So a bit about me. I work at Adobe, and Adobe has these 3 clouds. We have the Creative Cloud with Photoshop, Illustrator, the Document Cloud with Adobe Sign, PDF, and then the 3rd cloud is the Experience Cloud, and we produce more marketing software. That's where I work. I'm on a data management platform team, and I've had the opportunity of serving as the product champion or leader for internationalization on my team. And that means that our giant code base with Angular and React and some Backbone and jQuery, we are internationalizing the full app, and I've been leading that charge. So I've learned a lot of kind of really interesting, thorny engineering challenges of internationalization, and I wanted to share them out with the Angular community because I think they're fascinating from a code perspective. But I'm also really excited about this topic from a more human perspective. So many years ago, before I was a software engineer, I was a teacher. And I worked across Asia and West Africa. This is a photo from my class in Okinawa, Japan, back when I had hair, long ago. And so I know the challenge of really needing something to be translated and not having a translated version. And I've also learned about the importance of being culturally sensitive and aware to distinct cultures around the world. So my plan for today is to talk about what is internationalization, why it matters, and then some tips on how to implement it. We'll go over Angular implementation, talk about testing, TDD, deploying, CI/CD, and go over layout, design, and UX best practices. And then I want to end with some of those cultural considerations to take into account. And my goal for today, my mission, is to invite you all to join me and really put the world in the World Wide Web. You think you can do that? Yeah. Awesome. So let's kind of just level set and make sure we're all on the same page with some definitions. So to start, we have translation, or T9N. And translation is the most granular level. It's the process of translating text from one language into another. And I'm sure many people in the audience have translated before. We take hello, it becomes hola, konnichiwa, bonjour. The next level up of granularity is localization, or L10N. And localization is the process of translating the internationalized app into specific languages for particular locales. And we're here in London in the UK, but I spelled localization with a Z because I'm American and I live in the US. And that's kind of an example of localized text. So in the US, we would spell localization with a Z because we're English in the US. But in the UK, we would spell localization with an S because it's English in the UK. So they're both English, but they're different locales or regional dialectic variations. The next level up of granularity is internationalization, or i18n. And internationalization is the process of designing and preparing the app to be used within different locales. And keywords here are design, that's our layout, our UX, our CSS, and preparing. So preparing is our testing, our TDD, our deploying, and really bundling the full app to be sent to prod in each of the locales supported. And these all 3 fall under the umbrella of globalization, or G11N. And globalization also includes non-engineering topics like marketing, legal, sales, but we're not going to go over those today. And important to note that these are all numeric acronyms. So for internationalization, we take the first letter I, followed by the number of characters in between, 18, and then the last letter N, similar to A11Y for accessibility. Another important definition is Unicode. So Unicode is kind of the governing body for internationalizing software, and they do a great job of creating standards. And one of them is the Common Locale Data Repository, or CLDR. And they define our accept HTTP headers that we send for each locale. So one example to start is en-nz or NZ for English spoken in New Zealand. And this follows the most recent BCP 47 standard. And you can get more or less complex with it. So I want to go over an example that I think is kind of interesting to paint the picture of internationalization. So when I started, I said, hello, my name is Naomi Meyer. I use the common American English syntax, where I define myself by my first name or given name, followed by my last name, family name, or surname, right? And that's what most of us have been doing here at Angular Connect when we meet new people, right? But I did a poll around the office, and I translated this string into Japanese, konnichiwa, watashi no namae wa Maya Naomi desu, into Hindi, Hebrew, Arabic, Korean, and Chinese. And here, my first name is highlighted in blue, and my last name is highlighted in purple. And as you can see, sometimes the order flips. So sometimes people define themselves in certain cultures by their first name, last name. Sometimes it's last name, first name. And then obviously sometimes the text reads left to right, sometimes it reads right to left. So this is kind of what we're talking about when we're talking about internationalizing software. Because our users or our customers' names is such an important data point that we really want to get right in our apps. You know, if we accidentally display to our user their name in the wrong order, they could have a really negative experience working within our apps. And it's common for most of our kind of Western developed apps that are built first in English to use the structure of asking users to enter their name in a form where we have two separate input fields of first name and last name, and then we store those as separate columns in our database. And this is a very sort of Western approach to user data. And I don't think it's as inclusive as it could be. So a lot of countries actually don't follow the American syntax of first name, last name, like my name. Many people have 5 or 6 names. You know, in South America, I have many friends who have 3 different last names. And so it's challenging for them to really enter their names and make sure that they're stored correctly. So one possible solution to this problem is to allow the user to simply enter their name and store the name as whatever the user has entered and display it correctly. But there's other solutions to solve this problem. And folks might be looking at this and thinking, Naomi Meyer, Meyer Naomi, like that's a lot of work. Why should we do this? Why should we care? And if we look at the world's most spoken languages, English is not number 1. And the majority of people on Earth do not speak English as their first language. So by internationalizing and localizing our apps, we really have an opportunity from a business perspective to expand into new markets and target new customers. From a user perspective, we display a lot of really critical, important error messages, like, warning, you're about to delete everything in the app. And if our users can't really understand that, they're going to have a negative experience. You know, I've heard stories of my friends' parents who say that they just guess when they're trying to click through in an app when they don't understand the language. And from a people perspective, I think it's really useful to allow our users to navigate our apps in their native mother tongues. So ultimately, I think internationalization is good for business, it's good for people, and it's good for the world. So let's talk about how we actually do that. Let's go over the 4 steps to internationalize an Angular app. So step 0, mark static text for translation. The next step is to extract the text into a translation source file. Step 2 is to translate the file and then test the translated file for each locale. And the final step is to use the Angular compiler to generate a new version of the app. So, static text. Here we have our app.components.html file. We have an h1 tag that says, dolphins and whales are awesome. You know, we're at Angular Connect, and my favorite animal are both dolphins and whales, so I couldn't pick just one. Under the sea, right? And this is kind of an example of what not to do. We have a hard-coded English string in this h1 tag. So what we can do is we can wrap this string in an i18n attribute. And this is an Angular attribute that is removed after compilation. So we can include the i18n attribute in an ng container here or an img tag with the i18n title. And it's an Angular attribute, not an Angular directive. So another important thing is to help our translators. So if we go back, this is totally acceptable. You can do this and fully internationalize your app. But if you want to kind of go above and beyond, one thing you can do to really make your translations as great as they can be is to think about your translators. So this is a photo from a group of translators who I worked with in Myanmar, Burma. And I like to really keep them in mind because translators have a challenging job, right? And we can help make their job a lot easier by giving them additional context about where the strings are in the apps and what they're actually doing. So to give our translators context, we can take that same h1 tag and we can include the meaning. So here the meaning is page header, followed by the pipe syntax, and then a description of what the text is doing and where it is in the app, and then finally using the ampersand syntax, add a custom ID. And this really helps your translators. Another thing translators have to think about is they have to consider gender and acronyms. So often technical acronyms in sort of ABC text are challenging to translate. They have to keep in mind, so it can be really difficult to translate sarcasm in English or slang in English. Those are often mistranslated. So I know sometimes, as Angular devs, we don't necessarily have control over the copy in our apps, but a good rule of thumb is to really try and avoid sarcasm or slang. And then word order. So translators need the option to modify word order in their apps. So if you can avoid concatenating strings or building UI that's based on word order, it can be much more inclusive if you don't do that. And another thing translators really need to take into account is pluralization. So pluralization really changes from different locales. And this is an example of kind of what not to do. We have a span with updated the variable minutes ago. So what we can do instead is we can use the Angular pluralization tool. And this is how it works. So we have the first parameter is the key, and the key here is the variable of minutes. The second parameter will identify the plural translation type, and then the third parameter is the most important, and this defines the pluralization pattern. So here we have the pluralization pattern of 0, 1, and other are the categories, and then they're matching values with just now, 1 minute ago, and minutes ago. And in English, we're used to maybe adding or removing an S for different pluralization types, but in other locales, the full word can completely change across languages. I heard recently in Slovakian, the full word will modify based on each of the different pluralization types. And for every fifth word, the word completely changes, I'm told. I don't speak Slovakian, but that's what I've been told. And also for Russian and German, different locales, their pluralization categories are very important. Also numbers. So any place an integer is displayed in your app, it's so important to format it correctly for each locale. So this is our numbers, our dates, times, currencies, calendars. These all need to be formatted for internationalization. And there's some great tools available to you to format these numbers correctly. So something I learned also that I think was just really fascinating is in English, we're used to, if we have a long number, like 1 million, every third character will add a comma. But in Chinese, it's not every third character of a number, it's every fourth character of a number. So if you're shortening long numbers with internationalization, you need to keep those kind of distinct use cases in mind. So that's what we need to do for the first step. The next step is to, from the Angular CLI, run ngx i18n to generate the main translation file. And that looks like this messages.xlf file that you can put in your locale folder. And then you can include additional files with the messages.locale.xlf format for each of your locales supported. So here I added one for French. The next step is to test all the things. So this is testing all of your strings, and you can use whichever testing tool you use, and include snapshots for each of the locales supported. And then another important thing to test is the functionality of your app. So things like sorting and filtering. Angular devs were all used to building a sort function for ascending, descending characters with ABC. But sorting in different locales means their dictionaries are ordered differently. So handling sorting and filtering across locales can be a challenging endeavor. One thing that you can use is string.prototype.locale compare function from JavaScript, but there's other tools and libraries that can help with sorting and filtering. Also keyboards. So if you include hotkeys or short keys in your apps, oftentimes different locales, their keyboard structure can be different. So if you, a good rule of thumb is to force alphanumeric keys only. I've heard stories of some of the big design apps at Adobe that have lots of short keys and hotkeys. Their process of internationalizing those keyboard shortcuts was rigorous. So really kind of make yourself or future engineers happy by keeping your short keys alphanumeric and testing them. And then the final step is use the Angular compiler to generate a new version of the app for each of the locales supported. And there you have it. That's all you really need to do. It's not as hard as people might think. And the Angular compiler way to do it is fine, but I wanted to share the way that we do it at Adobe. We do a process that we call continuous localization. And we have a number of custom tools and pipelines that we include for localizing and updating all of our strings. And this is kind of a big software company way of doing it, but something that I think is really important when we look at this crazy diagram is to just really keep internationalization in mind when architecting your deployment process, because it's a lot easier to add it at the early stages of architecting an app than many years down the line. So keep internationalization and localization in mind in your CI/CD architecture. Another thing that we've been exploring lately is, does anyone use a pre-push or pre-commit hook for ESLint or Prettier? I feel like that's very common practice, right? To make sure everyone on the team is on the same page with tabs versus spaces. So we've been adding a pre-push hook to update all of our strings with machine-translated strings. So developers can test the length of strings. So you can get creative with your architecture. I also wanted to quickly call out some of the awesome open source tools that are available to help with your internationalization process. So ECMAScript out of the box has the internationalization API, and that includes the INTL object. And this can be really useful for handling dates and times. Also Moment.js. Anyone using Moment.js? Woohoo, Moment. Love it. It's such a great project, and they support so many locales. It's very useful. And then globalized.js, awesome open source tool, and i18 Next. And i18 Next is useful because it's framework agnostic. So if you have Angular plus other JavaScript frameworks, i18 Next can help handle that for you. Next, let's talk about design, layout, and UX. So please allow for the expansion of UI elements. This is the biggest UI bug that we find with internationalizing layouts. So here's kind of an extreme example, but I have the word blip in English. That's 4 characters, starting at the index of 1. And when I translate this word blip into Russian, it's 28 characters long. So this is really important to handle the flex of these longer strings. So a good rule of thumb to follow is that if the English text is less than 10 characters, handle at least a 300% expansion. So this is your submit button, your login button. These need to really expand. But if the English text is greater than 10 characters, you can handle a 30% expansion. But we have tools for this, right? We can use CSS Grid and Flexbox and other tools that are designed or thought of for more responsive design and handle the flex of our internationalized strings. Also right to left. Dun, dun, dun. Right to left is a challenging layout change. Here's an example of the adobe.com footer that is in Arabic, and as you can see, the whole footer changes to read right to left. So there's a number of tools available. The one that I suggest is PostCSS, RTL tooling, and they're an awesome open source project, and you can handle the full layout change with just CSS. Also, graphics. So here's an example of a P for parking. And I'm sure we've all seen P for parking in icons and graphics. But this is not really an inclusive icon that a diverse range of people around the world can truly understand. So instead of using the P for parking, which some people might say, well, P has become an international sign for parking. I think that's part of the problem, because instead of forcing English only as our international signs for iconography, what we can instead do is keep strings separate from graphics, icons, and photos, and make icons that are inclusive to a diverse range of people around the world. Like this smiling car that I thought was cute. Also, localized images. So this one I think is fascinating because we have an opportunity to really personalize our content to users from around the world. So here's 2 Adobe stock images of people smiling and driving. And one, the driver is on the left. The other, the driver is on the right. So I want to make sure when I'm here in London in the UK, I'm displaying the correct driver side to my users in their app. So this is kind of a very literal example because clearly in different places people drive on different sides. But there's other sort of more nuanced versions where you can include images that are culturally relevant. So, different people displayed, different like religious symbols, different icons, really making sure that you're personalizing your content for your users around the world. Also, colors. So colors can have different meanings across certain cultures. And here we have an example of an Adobe stock price app, where in the English locale version, we have change as highlighted as +8 in green. But in the Japanese localized version of the app, change is highlighted as +8 in red. And that's because in Western cultures, red is often associated with danger, warning, error messages. But in parts of East Asia, red is a color that's associated with happiness and joy. If you think about Tibet or Buddhist monks, they wear saffron red robes, and it's a color that's has much more positive association in parts of East Asia than here in Western cultures. So being really sensitive and culturally aware to colors and what they really mean around the world can be useful. So let's talk more about these cultural considerations to take into account. Documentation. So documentation is an opportunity to expand your users. And I've heard that the Angular documentation is not fully translated across locales. So I think really translating documentation and having documentation for people all around the world can make open source projects even better and can get more developers around the world involved in projects. So documentation is key. The next step is, so this is an example of a locale switcher that has flags to represent locales. And many languages are spoken in many countries around the world. And many countries speak multiple languages. So instead of using a flag to represent a locale, you can use the region or language, like we do on adobe.com. So another thing that I think is really important to talk about that doesn't necessarily pertain to Angular directly is voice. So I have a lot of friends who speak with a thick accent, and when they talk to Siri or Alexa, their voices are not understood. And there's a variety of reasons why, but one of those is because a lot of these voice tools are built with biased data sets that include people with only certain accents. So Mozilla has this awesome project called the Mozilla Common Voice Project. And what you can do is you can donate your voice, or you can listen to help validate voices donated. And I think it's so important because the diversity of voices helps the product over the long haul. So the next thing that's important to think about is countries, territories, and maps. So a lot of the big software companies have actually gotten in trouble with how they're displaying maps and lines on a map, because this can be a subject that's very important to be culturally sensitive to. And as Angular devs, we might be more likely to, excuse me, got a little bit of a cough here. So we might be more likely to simply query an API and get a list of countries, but we don't think deeply about the business implications and what those are actually saying. So thinking about our mapping software, our list of countries and territories is important to keep in mind. And this is a subject that I'm really passionate about, especially after my work living in West Africa. So I spent over a year in this small village called Komtoega in Burkina Faso, West Africa. And these kids were my neighbors, and they're really great at soccer or football. And they grow up speaking Moray, which is a tribal African dialect. And it's a beautiful language that has a lot of cultural significance. But then when they go to school, they're required to learn French, because Burkina Faso is a former French colony. So unfortunately, what's happening is their language, Moray, is now becoming an endangered language. And this map, each dot represents an endangered or critically endangered language on Earth. So I think this is sad. And I think it's really important to preserve languages that have cultural significance around the world. I think about it kind of like food. I know most of us probably love the experience of sampling diverse, unique cuisines from different countries around the world. And sometimes the food is really spicy, sometimes it's really sour, sometimes it's sweet, and having lots of different delicious food is great, and it's so much better than eating the same sort of bland, boring food every day, all day, right? And unfortunately, by building English-only apps, we're kind of feeding the world this one food this one language. And if we internationalize our apps, if we localize and allow users to navigate in whichever locale they prefer, we are making the world a more diverse and accessible place for people from all over. And I think, especially in the crazy political climate that we're living in today, in our humble role, as Angular developers, we have an opportunity to build with inclusivity, to build with diversity, and really join together and put the world in the World Wide Web. Thank you.